Why did God become a man? This is the most important question in the Christian tradition. And today, we're going to explore that by looking at one saint's book, On the Incarnation. This book was published 400 years after Christ's death and resurrection, and yet it succinctly and pithily summarizes why God became a man. Until that point, there was a lot of different ideas out there on why God had become a man. There was even small factions of Christianity that didn't quite understand or articulate exactly how Jesus was God. Today, we're going to try to unravel some of that. I'm going to give you some of my own thoughts as well as to how we should be thinking about the incarnation and why it's relevant to us even today. So with that, let's dive into the book. So the first thing that St. Athanasius actually starts us off on is couching the reasons for why God became a man as two divine dilemmas, as he calls them. The first is this issue with justice and mercy. How could God, an all-powerful God, reconcile the need for him to be just with the desire for him to be good and to save all of humanity? Right. This is a strange way of thinking about God. We're going to talk about this a little bit later. That's the first question, the first dilemma that God is trying to solve for, according to St. Athanasius. The second dilemma is around knowledge and ignorance. How does a good and all-powerful God reconcile his desire for humanity to know him with our rejection of him? Right. So he wants something, he wants us to love him, but we're rejecting him back. So it's a double dilemma. Now, these are unusual ideas because when we think about God, we think about him being all-powerful. So the real question to ask here is not how to solve the dilemmas, although that's an important question. The first question to ask is, how do you have an all-powerful being end up in any dilemma? It doesn't make any sense. There's a lot of things in life that are inherently paradoxical. Maximizing freedom, for example. To maximize everyone's freedom, we have to use something called the law. And what the law does, it actually restricts people's freedom in certain ways. Freedom for somebody to punch me in the face, for example, in order to maximize everyone's freedom. So in order for me to hit the maximal point of freedom, I need to minimize certain types of freedom. Because if I don't minimize any type of freedom at all, including the freedom to do violence, then I've actually minimized the ability for people to express their own freedom. So there's a sweet spot, if you will, when it comes to maximizing freedom that comes at the expense of certain freedoms. If you think about belief or faith, oftentimes the path to maximizing someone's faith and trust is through a period of doubt. Think about St. Paul. Think about even C.S. Lewis. Think even about Mother Teresa. All these people, at some point or another, had either persecuted the church altogether or had gone through serious doubts themselves. But it is only through going through those periods of their life that they were able to become the people that they were. One cannot fully appreciate the goodness of life without experiencing some level of travesty and disaster. So in a sense, when we think about the all-powerful God, it is not necessarily contradictory to think about an all-powerful God going through some sort of dilemma within him. Okay, because there's many ways where things can only be maximized by taking away from those things. Now, I've given you a few examples, but you might think, okay, well, these examples apply to humans. Humans are complicated creatures, but with God, we're dealing with the absolute infinite. Turns out, though, that these paradoxes exist even in the world of mathematics. And this goes back to the spirit of this channel, Convergent Christianity. How do we find these universal truths of Christianity embedded in other parts of our world? This is an equation that we've all seen in elementary school in some way. Infinity minus 1 is still infinity. I can take a lot out of infinity, but it still retains the concept of infinity. If you think about some of the paradoxes that mathematicians discovered in the 19th century, a lot of them were puzzled because they started discovering strange properties of infinity, like this one, like the idea that there are the same number of natural numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, as there are even numbers, because you can match those two together. There's actually an equal number of numbers, of even numbers, as there are all numbers. Let me draw your attention to another paradox. This is called the Aristotelian paradox. Two circles, a small one and a big one. And I ask you, which is the bigger circle? You'll point to the bigger one, of course, the one on the outside. And then I say, okay, let me prove to you that the exact same number of points exist on the small circle as the big circle. Because after all, what is a circle? It's a line that touches itself, right? And what is a line but an infinite number of points? You might think, oh, there's a greater number of infinite points in the big circle than the small circle. And yet I can still draw a line to match every single point in the small circle with the big circle. And these are the paradoxes that we run into when we deal with a concept like the infinite. Here's something I want you all to remember. If your concept of God makes sense logically, then you have the wrong picture of God. God transcends your common intuitions. And I think we get a flavor of that when we start thinking through the paradoxes that we experience in our lives, but also the inherent paradoxes that exist within mathematics as you deal with infinity. Now that we've made sense, or at least made some peace with the concept of a dilemma and an infinite God, let's unpack why these dilemmas exist. In order, again, to answer a question, you have to start at the beginning, and this is exactly what St. Athanasius does. He goes right back to Genesis. From the tree of knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat. On the day you eat of it, you shall die. What else might it be except not merely to die, but to remain in the corruption of death? So here St. Athanasius is quoting the opening passages of Genesis, when God is providing a warning to Adam and Eve on not to eat from the tree. And he points out something very interesting. He looks at the word choice that the Genesis writer uses. And if you look at the Hebrew, the term is mot tamot, die by death. The word death is repeated twice. Now, in the New King James Version, we read that as you shall surely die. So the emphasis on death is through the word surely. But St. Athanasius has a slightly different reading of this, and he's saying death is almost personified here. And because death is killing you, you're going to remain in that corruption of death. What's happening here is that death is not just something that happens to us, it is an enemy that causes us to die. Here's St. Athanasius again. Death holding greater sway and corruption remaining fast against humans. The race of humans was perishing, and the human being, made rational and in the image, was disappearing, and the work made by God was being obliterated. By the law, death prevailed against us, and it was impossible to escape the law, since this had been established by God on account of the transgression. And what happened was both absurd and improper. Listen to what St. Athanasius is saying there. The consequences of death is disappearance. It's being completely vanquished. And this is what spurs the need for God to incarnate, because what was happening was absurd and improper to him. Let's dig into this idea of human beings disappearing. For transgression of the commandment was turning them back to their natural state, so that just as they have had their being out of nothing, so also, as might be expected, they might look for corruption into nothing in the course of time. In other words, that they should be disintegrated and abide in death and corruption. So what St. Athanasius is saying here is that it's a dust to dust. We were created out of nothing, and because of the sin, we were going to disappear back into nothing. And the natural state here, it's not a good thing, it's a bad thing, because our natural state is to not exist. And this was the process that was kicked off through the act of disobedience. The process of living started to reverse. St. Athanasius goes even further to say that, think about life as a fortress, and death was at the door, and death was about to knock down that fortress altogether. What God had to do through his son Jesus is to enter that fortress as a strong man enters the fortress, to dissuade death from entering. St. Athanasius then picks up a difficult question, which is, why wasn't repentance sufficient? Why can't I just confess the sin away? St. Athanasius writes, there was only offense and not the consequence of corruption, repentance would have been fine. Human beings were now held fast in natural corruption and were deprived of the grace of being in the image. What else needed to happen? Being the Word of the Father, and above all, He alone consequently was both able to recreate the universe and suffer on behalf of all. He's saying that the process of creation was effectively being unwound by the fall. And what needed to happen was for God, through the Son, to recreate the universe altogether. This is radical. I have never personally been taught that the fall was the uncreation of the cosmos, but that is effectively what St. Athanasius is saying here. So, in order to appreciate the Incarnation, one has to understand the gravity of the fall. So now that we've looked at the genesis of the fall and how that created a rift between God and humanity, let's talk a little bit about the efforts that God had to go through in order to reach humanity. Here's the problem in a nutshell. We have the uncreated, that's God. We have the created, and there's a gap between them. How do we close the loop between the uncreated and the created? Because the created can't reach the uncreated because of this existential gap. So this is what God tries to do. The first thing that God tries to do is provide us two things: the law and the works of creation. The law is that which He provides Moses. We'll talk about that a little later. And the second is the works of creation. God wants humanity to know Him through His creation. Let's look at what St. Athanasius has to say. First, the law. It is interesting to note here what he says, so listen carefully. For the law was not only for the Jews, nor on their account only were the prophets sent. They were for the whole inhabited world, a sacred school of the knowledge of God and the conduct of the soul. St. Athanasius is saying that the law was not just for a select group of people, the Hebrews who became the Jews, but it was for everybody. It started off with the Jews, absolutely, but the intent of the law was for it to spread ultimately. Does that go very well? The answer is not quite, and you can read the entire Old Testament to find out why and how. What did the people do? Instead of following the law, instead of trying to get to God through the avenue of the created works, they debase themselves, St. Athanasius says. They go down and they seek idols. So what did this mean? Well, it meant that the uncreated now had to find a way to reach the created. And this is where the begotten comes in. And we say in our creed, begotten, not created. Begotten here means caused. So in the same way you have a sun that causes heat, right? The heat is begotten from the sun. In the same way here, we have the uncreated. Emanating out of the uncreated is the begotten Son of God. So what does this mean? Well, St. Athanasius provides us an image of restoration. Here's what he says. You know what happens when a portrait that has been painted on a panel becomes obliterated through external stains? The artist does not throw away the panel, but the subject of the portrait has to come and sit for it again, and then the likeness is redrawn on the same material. So what St. Athanasius is saying here, going back to this idea of obliteration, annihilation, uncreation, the original model for the portrait has to come and sit down again for the painting to be redrawn because we are in His image. And that is exactly the purpose of the begotten, Christ. It is to allow the Father to recreate humanity in His image. And it is only by participating in that divine love that we could be recreated. And this is exactly what the Christian life is all about. But it's not just about the portrait and about recreating the image. It's also about the teaching. This is where St. Athanasius talks about God the teacher. For since in the wisdom of God, the world did not know God through wisdom, it pleased God through the folly of preaching to save those who believe. So what is that folly? What is this foolishness of the preaching that allows the created to draw closer to the Creator? Well, St. Athanasius answers that question as well. Once the mind of human beings descended to perceptible things, the Word himself submitted to appear through a body, so that as a human he might bring humans to himself and return their sense perception to himself. He was not contained by anyone, but rather himself contained everything. He is in essence outside everything, but inside everything, containing the universe and not being contained by the universe. This is quite a riddle that St. Athanasius is pulling on us. Let's break it down. Once the mind of human beings descended to perceptible things. So what St. Athanasius is implying here is that before the fall, human beings did not care for the material world. Their minds were fixated on the spiritual. But because of this fall from the spiritual to the material, where our focus has changed, the Word himself had to now become where we were focusing our gaze effectively, so that he can now change our gaze and make us focus back on the spiritual. And here's where it gets very bizarre. He talks about how Christ was not contained by anyone, but rather himself contained everything. He's in essence outside everything, but inside everything. I thought about the idea of fractals. A fractal is a self-repeating pattern at different orders of magnitude. Right, so if you look at the Mandelbrot fractal as well, you'll see those two black blobs. But as you zoom in on the little parts of the black blob, you start seeing the same black blob over and over and over again. You zoom in more, you find it again. You zoom in more, you find more of it. So at different orders of magnitude, you find the same thing, right? At different zoom levels, if you will. But a fractal is this idea of being outside everything, but is also inside everything. Because the more you zoom in, the more you find the same thing. And this will go on forever. How are fractals created? So here's an example of a fractal. This is the mathematical equation. You'll see here that in order for me to find the value of the next variable in a fractal, I have to use the previous answer. A fractal is recursive, which means it depends on the past in order to understand what the future is. A fractal is essentially something that uses itself to create more of itself in different ways. That's sort of what creation is, right? Because before the beginning, you had God. What does God do? God creates something out of nothing, right? But that thing, there's a certain essence that thing that God creates shares with God. Now, it's not the godly essence, but the fact that it exists means that it's sharing in some property of God himself. How God is, in some sense, imparting one property of him into something outside of him. And then that thing starts to propagate itself. So in some sense, this idea that God is the outside everything, but also inside everything because he has created everything through this recursive formula. St. Athanasius is channeling a truth that goes far beyond just the esoteric theology. It's a truth that exists in mathematics. It's a truth that we observe in the natural world. Think about a piece of broccoli, for example. Even a piece of broccoli, on the outside it looks like broccoli, but as you zoom in on different parts of the broccoli, it looks more and more like a mini broccoli until at some point there is no broccoli, of course. But broccoli is as an example of a fractal, because fractals use themselves to grow in the same way God has, in some sense, used his own essence to create something outside of him. And then that thing outside of him is self-generative, right? But it would not be self-generative unless it shared that self-generative property with God. And of course, God is also self-generative. St. Athanasius then talks about why God could not have just done all this with a nod. This is the second time St. Athanasius does this, by the way. He takes this rebuttal very seriously. This idea that, because God is all-powerful, then he can just snap his fingers. A couple of things he says here. When nothing at all existed, only a nod and an act of will was needed for the creation of the universe. But when human being was made, it followed that the healer and savior had to come among those who had already been created. If death was interwoven with the body and dominated it as if it united to it, it was necessary for life to be interwoven with the body, so that the body putting on life should be cast off corruption. Just as straw is naturally destroyed by fire, if anyone keeps the fire away from the straw. If someone covers it with asbestos, which is fireproof, the straw no longer fears the fire. So St. Athanasius here is saying God needed to come down and fix the situation. As a healer, he also likens God as asbestos. Of course, at the time, he didn't know the full consequences of asbestos, but for many years, for many centuries, it was used to fireproof things. There needs to be an incarnation because there is a there is a rift between God and humanity. And so he needs to come down and protect humanity from the consequences, this pain of death. And that really is the story of the Incarnation. The other thing to understand, however, that I want to take note of is the idea that love is inherently an action, and an infinitely loving God must therefore enact love in an infinite way. And one cannot have the full experience of love by just thinking it. Inherently within love, there is this idea of sacrifice. To love something and to demonstrate that love for something is to demonstrate sacrifice. There is no way around it. If God is loving and love is sacrifice, then God must be sacrificial. If God is infinitely loving, then he must be infinitely sacrificial. And what is the most sacrificial thing one can do is to sacrifice himself and his son, who shares in the same essence as him. So in some sense, by this singular act, God fulfills the requirements of love. And love is inherently sacrificial. Now you might be asking, why does love need to be sacrificial? Love needs to be sacrificial because we live in a world that is fallen. Before the fall, there was no sacrifice needed because there was nothing to sacrifice for, because nothing was fallen. So a nod would have sufficed. But after the fall, one has to reverse the fall. And can a snap of the fingers do it? No, because now the definition of love has changed, right? The definition of love is to upend creation through an act of sacrifice, and that's exactly what God does. Is it enough to believe that the Incarnation just happened? I don't think so. After all, even the demons tremble. I think in order to appreciate the Incarnation, one has to start seeing it like a fractal in different parts of his or her life. So let me give you a few ideas on how to do that. What is the pattern of the Incarnation? Well, it's a story. And that story is this. We start from a state of perfection, blissful ignorance, nothing is going wrong. And then we fall into sin. And out of that sin, we try to atone, and we get pulled back up out of that sin. So perfection, sin, atonement. That's the incarnational fractal. This is the pattern that I think imbues all our lives. Think of, for example, our careers. Think of meaningful fulfillment in one's work or studies. At some point or another, whether in school or in work, there's going to be a point of failure. That's the fall. But out of that failure, in order to atone out of that failure, if you will, one has to discover balance. This failure could just be burnout. It could be failing an exam, a course, failing out of school, getting fired. Regardless, out of that failure, atonement, what does it look like? It's discovering balance, recovering perspective. Think about relationships. One might enter a relationship in blissful naivete, young love. At some point or another, there's going to be conflict, betrayal even. But out of that conflict, forgiveness and reconciliation. Things are stronger because of the fall. Think about the pattern of scientific truth. We make a new scientific discovery. We feel like gods. But then those scientific discoveries are used for exploitation, violence. Right? But out of that violence and exploitation, we learn new lessons. We become more responsible with our innovation. We become more ethical in our research. The incarnational fractal is even used in our own political mythologies. The past, for some folks, is an ideal state. It's something that we have to return to. But because of nefarious forces, because of corruption, because of capitalism, that's more of a left-wing or liberal ideal, we've been dragged into the mud, right? And so what do we have to do? Well, we have to atone. We need to have advocacy. We need to have reform, activism. That could also mean a return to tradition. Sometimes it's progressing away from tradition. So depending on one's political ideology, and this applies to the left and to the right, there's a mythology behind it. And that mythology mimics the incarnational fractal. Joseph Campbell actually talks about this as the hero's journey as well. You can see the similar pattern here. Now, of course, the incarnational fractal is rife within the Bible. The history of the Hebrews, first being in Canaan, going to Egypt, being enslaved, and then going back into the promised land. Prodigal son, he's at home, blissful ignorance, everyone's happy. He leaves, goes on this journey, ends up in the pigsty, and then he has to return home. This is the incarnational fractal. It's living perfection, sin, and atonement. This is exactly what Christ's life is, right? So he starts off pre-incarnation, comes into the world, takes on sin and death, dies, and then resurrects. Of course, that's the incarnational fractal, but it's also in the history of humanity. Adam and Eve in the garden, everything's perfect. They fall, but now there is a chance to atone. It's a pattern that exists in our lives, and I think it makes the book On the Incarnation very much a worthwhile read, and it helps us understand why God came to save us. So the answer to this video is God had to come because it was in his nature to come, because God is love. Love is inherently sacrificial. It is sacrificial because there is a rift, one that happened because of our will, and we have that free will because in order to love God back, we need the freedom to be able to choose otherwise, which is why freedom is the prerequisite for love. And to seed into love is choice. And that choice cannot be made unless it is made freely. So really, the problem here, the initial problem, was freedom. He gave us freedom to choose to love him. When we chose, as a race of human beings, to not love him, we fell. And that created a rift. That created a dilemma for God. So what did God have to do? He had to become like us to pull us out of the pigsty. And this is exactly the story of the incarnation. And it's a pattern we see in our lives, and we see in the world, and we see it in all our stories. So thanks for listening, and I hope this was educational. Please leave a comment if you have anything to say.